Perioada grούμε, չէ՞։ Հա։ Դա։ Arranz. Что это?
Paldies, շնորհակալություն մեր հրավերություններու եւ վերահսկողական հանրայնքնամանը ձերմասնակության համար։ Հիշեցնեմ, որ մեր այսօրվա թեման շենքերի էներգոարդյունավետությունն է։ Քննարկումը ինչպես նախորդ անգամ ունեցել ենք, նախորդ մեր քննարկումներն տեսանյութը կզիջենք, որից հետո կլինի քննարկում բանախոսների միջև ու բանախոսների հետ, ապա կլինեն հարցեր դահլիճից, Sergey Arzumanyan, Humanity կազմակերպության ծրագրերի ղեկավար,
Tanya Arzumanyan, Urban Development Committee Residential Fund and Utility Department Head, and Astghine Pasoyan, Energy Efficiency Support Foundation Director. I want to watch the video and then have the discussion.
Որից 33-ը սպիտակում, 12-ը վայրկում։ Այս մուտքի դռները պատուհաններ չեն ունեցել, որի պատճառով մարդիկ, քանի որ մուտքն էլ լուսավորված չի, մարդիկ ստիպված միշտ բաց էին պահում։ Որպեսզի դա չլինի, մենք առաջին հերթին որոշեցինք, որ պատուհան դնենք, բացի դրանից, որտեղ որ հնարավոր էր, մենք դուռը ջերմամեկուսացնելուց բացի ներսից դրեցինք եւս մի հատ միջնորմ դռնով, որտեղ դա հնարավոր չէր, ուղղակի դուռը ջերմամեկուսացրեցինք եւ դրեցինք փակող սարք, ավտոմատ փակող սարք, որը դուռը փակում է։ Աստիճանահարթակները մենք փոխել ենք պատուհանները։ Սրանք եղել են հին պատուհաններ, ապակիները ջարդվածել են եղել, փայտե հին պատուհաններ են եղել։ Հիմա մենք դրել ենք երկշերտ ապակե փաթեթով մետաղապլաստե պատուհաններ, որը ջերմաարդյունավետ է համարվում։
Իսկ ո՞նց են ընտրվել հենց այս շենքերը վայքում։
Շենքերի ընտրությունը կատարել են քաղաքապետարանները։ Ընտրության հիմնական չափորոշիչը եղել է երևի շենքերի տեխնիկական վիճակը։
Այս շենքի ջերմամեկուսացման բարիքները հիմնականում քաղում են վերջին հարկի բնակիչները, ջերմամեկուսացված տանիքի շնորհիվ։
Սա գոլորշաթող, բայց հիդրոմեկուսիչ շերտ է։ Եթե խոնավություն իր վրա կաթա, ինքը չի թողելու, բայց ներքևից եթե գոլորշի լինի, ինքը բացաթողում վերև։ Այսինքն չի թողում, որ իր տակի ջերմամեկուսիչ շերտը խոնավանա։ Դրա տակ հանքային բամբակ է։
Բա մինչև այս ծրագիրը ամսական ինչքան եք վճարում գազի համար։
Գազին միջև 30, երևի ցուրտ վաղտը, բայց ահագին օգնե, հա։
Հիմա ինչքան եք վճարում։
Այդ ամիս 12000։
Ստերից ոնց որ գալ մարդու գլխի սարուժ դնենք, բայց հիմա ջերմությունը լավ ապահովում է։ Չէ, այդ տեսակետից ասենք գոհենք, ոնց որ ասած փրկվանք։
Վայքի ջերմամեկուսացված շենքերի կողքին կան չջերմամեկուսացված, չվերանորոգված շենքեր։ Նման շենքերի շքամուտքերում գրեթե նույն ջերմաստիճանն է ինչ դրսում, իսկ վերջին հարկի բնակիչները ձմռանը մյուսներից ավելի շատ կոմունալ վճարումներ են անում։ Նման շենքերի բնակարաններում հաճախ կարելի է ավանդական լուծումներ տեսնել, օրինակ պատին կախված գորգ, որը բացի կոլորիտից կոնկրետ ջերմամեկուսիչ դեր ունի։ Ամսական մոտավոր ինչքան է գազի վարձ տալիս ձմռան
Մինչև 40-45։
Այստեղ մի քանի շենքերում տանիքները ջերմամեկուսացրել են, դուք տեղակ եք այդ մասին։
Ինչ որ այս ներքևի շենքերում կա, հա, բայց մեր մոտ այդ չի արվել։
Իրականում ցանկացած բազմաբնակարան շենքի բնակիչներ կարող են հասնել նրան, որպեսզի իրենց շենքը նույնպես ջերմամեկուսացվի։
Բնակիչների տները մտնում ես վերանորոգված, մաքուր, խնամված, իսկ շքամուտքում մենք տեսնում ենք կեղտոտ, թքած, կոտրած, հա, կոշիկի հետքով, չնորոգված, չներկված։ Մարդիկ պետք է հասկանան, որ եթե ներդրում արվի ընդհանուր տարածքների վրա, այսինքն ընդհանուր աստիճանային վանդակ, ընդհանուր տանիքը, իսկ իդեալական կլինի շենքի ամբողջ ֆասադը ջերմամեկուսացնել, դա ներդրում է ընդհանուրի մեջ, որը ամեն ընտանիքին առանձին ամսական կարող է 3-ից 6%-ով կրճատել գազի ծախսը, եթե միայն աստիճանավանդակը, եթե ֆասադն է ջերմամեկուսացում, մինչև 62% ջերուցման ծախսի նվազեցում են։
Տարածված մտածելակերպը, որ շենքերի ջերմամեկուսացման պարտավոր է զբաղվել պետությունը, իրականությանը չի համապատասխանում։
Այնից գարշունավետության կիրառությունը նոր կառուցվող բազմաբնակարան շենքերի վրա տարածվում է պարտադիր կարգով։ Մնացած դեպքերում իրավաբանական եւ ֆիզիկական անձանց կամավորության սկզբունքի վրա է հիմնված։
19 թվականի հունվարի վերջին փոփոխություն կատարվեց արդեն իսկ 2006 թվականից գործող կառավարության որոշման մեջ, որ համայնքները կարող են դիմել սուբվենցիա ստանալու, կային հասարակական նշանակության շենքերը, մանկապարտեզներ, դպրոցներ, ավելացավ նաև բազմաբնակարան շենքերը, որպես պետական մասնակցություն պարտադիր է դառնում ավտոմատ նաև էներգախնայողության միջոցառումները։
Բնակիչները կարող են միավորվել եւ սեփական ուժերով կայացնել շենքի էներգարդյունավետ ապագան։
Պետք է կարողանան գրավոր համաձայնության գան, որով մարդիկ երաշխավորեն, որ ես գիտակցում եմ իմ շենքում կատարվելիք ներդրումները եւ հասկանում եմ, որ սա նշանակում է, որ ես մոտակա 36 ամիսների ընթացքում պետք է վճարեմ X գումար։ Մենք խոսում ենք միջինը 10-12 հազար դրամ ներդրում քառակուսի մետրի հաշվով։ Կարող է մարդը իր տան վրա ծախսել մոտ ընդհանուր մինչև, չգիտեմ, 100,000 դրամ, բայց հենց առաջին ջերուսման սեզոնի ժամանակ խնայել ոչ պակաս քան 50-60,000 դրամ։
Մեկ շենքի բնակիչների համերաշխ որոշման շնորհիվ էներգարդյունավետ դարձած շենքը կարող է լավ նախադեպ դառնալ։ Բանկերը վստահություն կունենան համատիրություններին վարկեր տրամադրելու համար, բնակիչները կունենան ավելի տաք տուն ու ավելի քիչ կոմունալ ծախսեր, իսկ երկիրը կայուն էներգետիկ ապագա կունենա, անկախություն ձեռք բերելով ներմուծվող էներգիայից։ Ավելի տաք տուն ու ավելի քիչ
We've spoken a lot about identifying new sources of energy, new energy carriers, and generally alternative renewable energy sources, wind and solar, but we have apparently ignored the great potential that exists in energy saving. I'd like to ask you the following question, Astghine. If just comparing in percentages, in numbers, how does the system look right now? How much may we save and how much can we generate? Thank you. Well, thank you for the film, because people who've been in this sector know very well that we have such a murky eerie gap in the sector that the more we contribute, the better it is. We will never overdo here because there is a different issue. Now, as regards the sector specifically, there are Soviet time inherited traditions. When they speak of energy, especially in Armenia, they traditionally perceive generation of energy. I mean, if there is a government program, long-term strategy, low-cost development, etc., all of it is ultimately related to generation of energy. What's going to happen to the nuclear power plant, to gas distribution, Iran-Armenia gas supply, transmission networks or high voltage electric networks, etc. So, I mean, new combined cycle thermal power generators, etc. These are all very good and they're very important, and analysis assert that the energy consumption is going to grow by 3% every year in Armenia. There is such a forecast. However, we forget traditionally one very important point, that if we do not critically analyze the structure of energy consumption and the efficiency thereof, then we will be just running behind the train that will be moving ahead slowly, moving away from us. So the more contemporary approach is to identify the consumption part and the demand side management, so-called. Unfortunately, we're lame here. Well, naturally, Armenia is quite different from the other countries of the region in this respect, because we adopted the law on energy efficiency and renewable energy in 2014, as you apparently noticed in the film, and a lot of parts of the sector are still on voluntary basis in the residential apartments. So in residential apartment buildings, and here we consume about 36% of all the energy produced in the Republic of Armenia, and if you look at the public buildings or add the public buildings, then it's over 40%. Now, based on the results of the energy audit with the most conservative estimates, even though the World Bank is present here, on Daniel Varujan Street in Avan district, we carried out a pilot project that showed that energy efficiency may reach 60%. If we say that the residential apartments consume about 40% and we may ensure 50% of energy saving, then essentially we can save 18% of all the power generated. Is this anyhow compared to the power generated by the nuclear power plant? Well, the nuclear power plant generates about 1/3 of all the energy, but we have energy efficiency or an energy saving national program that clearly defines the potential in the public buildings, in transport, in agriculture, in all sectors where energy is being consumed. Respectively, the estimate in the national program is 37%. That is already comparable to the nuclear power plant. Well, it is very important when the main consumers of the energy are the multi-apartment buildings, then there has to be some public policies. I mean, it's very difficult to expect the residents to organize the process themselves. Tanya, this is a question addressed to you. Is there any public policy here? And if there is, then does it embrace the energy efficiency? And what is the government planning generally? Thank you. Well, before I turn to the main question of yours, I have to say that this is a very important initiative, what we're doing now. Nevertheless, you may consider this my personal opinion, but energy efficiency is not a goal in itself. Because we may save energy before some invasive measures, so-called, are implemented. So, I mean, all the trends, all the discussions have to be pointing towards energy efficiency, meaning the comfort has to be compared against 1 unit of consumption, especially in multi-apartment buildings. Moreover, while we speak of energy saving, the world strives for zero consumption, but nevertheless. The public policy, if to present in a nutshell, then the role of the government is more regulatory here. Establishment of bylaws and laws, development of strategic documents, and consideration of priority sectors in those strategic documents, support to all these initiatives and programs provided with the same principles. All of these ultimately aim at ensuring some uniformity in implementation of measures on the national level. Let me say, uniformity or cohesion of all the main directions. Astghine said already that according to the amendments made in the law on energy efficiency, some principles have been taken into account, yes, partially implemented on voluntary basis, even though mandatory, as the law says, especially in case of new buildings, only in the new buildings. So independently from any source of funding, it's a mandatory rule for any new construction in Armenia. Certain projects that are being implemented in the country have amounted to certain problems that are being tackled now by a number of international organizations, of which UNDP is highly appreciated, because with the support of the latter, the revisiting of the national legislation and bylaws has been carried out. There are certain problems, one of them mentioned by Habitat, related to the awareness of the population, the ability to come together around the problem and an attempt to solve it. Why do we segregate residential apartments? Because this is a different type of ownership. Like if a public building has one owner, then in case of a residential building, the owners are many, and not many in their entitlements, but many in their opinions and attitudes. Respectively, we need to have this collective opinion of the people residing in one building in order to do something in that building. So, provided the residents are not capable to do anything on the other side, so I'd like to mention that energy efficiency measures per se will hardly cover the whole territory. Sometimes they are not prescribed properly without consideration of seismic resilience of buildings, because seismic resilience has to be improved in the first place. Respectively, the cost increases significantly, and that means that only the owners or only the state may not solve the problem. And I'm sure you heard in the film the problem was mentioned. This year we have an unprecedented activity, an initiative through which the government participates in or wants to renovate common property areas in the buildings, supporting solar power generation. I mean, separate subventions by the state to enroll solar power opportunities in co-funding by the owners themselves. So I'm sure that such a participation of the government may also contribute to making some measures or such measures mandatory in order to break the ice ultimately. Doubtlessly, there are problems with the law on common property in residential apartments. I mean, if we are able to anyhow revisit these legal provisions through bylaws, that would also be a solution. At least if the building wants to do something, then that's definitely an issue of mutual agreement. I mean, they have to have the issue agreed with all the apartments in that building in order to do something. In this case, we might revisit the legislation and the bylaws. They tried to circulate some drafts previously, but now the process revoked. We are trying to draw on some details and brought this on the agenda of the Committee of Urban Development. Let's see how it works. Energy is one of the happiest sector on the governmental agenda, as it clearly embraces energy savings, efficiency, all cooperation-related issues with international organizations, all the opportunities. Took a little longer, I'm sorry. Very interesting, thank you. So we're now conversing policies, conversing general problems. Sergey, your organization has been directly working with people, with condominia, with local self-government bodies, as we saw in the film. So about 50 buildings have become energy efficient in Spitak and in Vajk. Tell us, please, what the main criteria of choice are. And how are the problems identified? Like, what is the main challenge, naturally? Well, I may understand that when a certain organization has a certain fund and does something, then it's one thing, and it's completely different when the citizens or the residents have to do something on their own. What's your experience? Well, first of all, you must know that Habitat, since 2011, started the implementation of a project on energy efficiency in multi-apartment buildings, different projects, but mostly in Yerevan. Since December 2014, when the opportunity opened for the project on renewable energy and energy saving in Spitak, and I'm the head of that project. So essentially, similar initiatives were implemented in communities beyond Yerevan, significantly different, of course, from those in Yerevan, but there were also attempts to replicate everything done in Yerevan in the regions of the country. But we understood from the very beginning that these attempts were always a failure and would be failures, and we changed the model, because there are no condominia in the regions. In Yerevan, the work is with the condominia, part of which are well perfected with certain criteria that give us the opportunity to choose the best buildings in terms of the ability to pay for the work carried out. It's easier to cooperate. But in Vajk and in Spitak, the picture is different. There are no condominia in these communities. There is the so-called office for maintenance that is in charge of taking care of the buildings. However, we may as well say they do not exist. They may appear only in emergencies. One of the reasons is that the fees for service are very low and the collection is about 40%. People don't pay, which means that the same model applied in Yerevan would never be possible to be replicated in the regions, unless the regions are ready to pay more for the services of their own buildings. And in Vajk, there was no office, even no office for maintaining the building, only utility payments place. And there's this organization for improvement of Vajk, but it did mostly waste collection. So, in such circumstances, we were simply forced to find a different solution together with the municipality, also amend the legislation and create the bodies for taking care of the buildings, and also some responsibility for keeping the building in a proper shape. So the model ultimately contributed to establishment of these building maintenance platforms. And by the way, we decided that in such buildings, it was a necessity. Like if the community pays 20%, then the donors made us tell the residents that they had to have some symbolic participation. Something at least had to be co-funded from the residents. So in order to decide how much of that co-funding was realistic, we carried out surveys in all these beneficiary buildings, and through these surveys we just understood to what extent people were enrolled in some own initiatives to maintain the buildings. We generally presented information to them on what has to be done and asked them to what extent they were ready to participate, or how much they could participate, roughly. So maybe one-time payments or maybe some monthly fees, and we asked them how much they were able to pay a month. We understood that the range was 500 to 2,000 Armenian drams per month they could pay. At least in more than 50% of the population surveyed in Vajk and in Spitak were ready to pay 500 and more. So the model that we developed was arranged in a way that this threshold fluctuates in the range of 600 to 1,000, and all the residents through the meetings reflected on that decision. We got the agreement of 2/3 of the population according to the law. People just signed these petitions, and then we signed contracts, so respectively obliging them to make the payments. I don't know how interested you are. I hope it is interesting though, but this is a practical experience, practical implementation attempt. Provided people were not able to pay right away, people would authorize those companies to go to the bank and take a credit on their behalf, which would then be serviced by the fees people would pay in the end of the month. However, these fees would comprise only 5 to 6% of the interest rate for the loan that had to be paid. We wrote that they could have paid 10%, but we understood in reality 10% would be too much, so we sufficed ourselves with the range we mentioned initially. The first tranche for 4 buildings in Spitak ultimately brought to real problems because banks were reluctant to issue such credits and people would not pay. In Vike, they refused paying at all. So we decided to go to the version that was discussed before that initially, and in the process we were making this transit. The law changed on energy and this net metering became a reality, so we understood that the project had to be improved, had to be changed. So we decided that the PV panels that had to be installed on the buildings to bring lights to the entrances became useless, non-efficient. So we thought that we could have brought all these PV panels in one place and use them for some public needs. But for the entrances, we would simply install LEDs with sensors and connect them to one of the apartments in that building that would agree to pay for that power. Respectively, those could be savings for the communities, and apart from that, if we sell any energy to the energy or electric networks of Armenia, then that money could be earmarked for some other things, other needs, however, sitting in that fund. So we decided that the fees the residents had to pay could be accumulated in one fund and then earmarked for some similar purposes for the future. Well, they can decide, I don't know, improvement of the entrance, staircases, insulate the roofs, or ensure street lights, or maybe develop solar energy, solar power. So these were the 3 main sectors where this circular fund could be active. Without any further details, I have to say that the project has very impressive achievements, even though it is yet halfway. We have insulated 43 buildings. One PV station with 14.5 kilowatts was built in Spitak. Vike has already tendered out the project to start this year, and the remaining 12 buildings will be covered this year. The preparatory work is ongoing. However, I want to say that apart from success stories, challenges, impediments such projects have, there are also opportunities. Organizations enrolled in such projects are usually meet and discuss their successes, achievements, and problems, which ultimately creates a good platform for raising the problems before the government, for submitting some documents to the government or to respective agencies of the government, so that changes are made in the legislation. Because through implementation, we've met different problems. By the way, in the communities, people usually see the visible part of a project, because all the projects have the visible and non-visible parts. They see the building, they see the PVs on the roof, they say, oh, it's a nice project. But we, the implementers and the donors, give more importance to the latent part of the process, because the latent part is of core importance for the sustainability of the project. The energy efficiency funds independently from how much money they accumulate, are very important in terms of sustainability. Also for the community, because they create an opportunity for the communities to find donors, and the donors are truly committed to invest in such communities and develop such funds rather than insulating faulty other buildings somewhere else. Let me now come back to this point. Very true indeed. The primary source of project implementation aims at problems identified in these buildings. I'm sure this information is public. However, according to a decree by the Prime Minister, by the end of last year, a task force was established for energy efficiency and energy saving, including renewable energy, in order to tackle the problems persisting to this sector. Especially the legislation and the bylaws have to be amended, have to be improved to remove any burden. I just want to say that this decree of the Prime Minister contributed to establishment of a very good platform that may host any company, any entity that faces problems and can solve them through that platform. So the legislation has been amended, the bylaws are being elaborated. I'm just trying to say that this is the best place to mention this, if you don't mind. In fact, and apparently, we have to divide the problems into several layers. The legislation, naturally, we may improve it and perfect it incessantly. One thing I want to say, not very popular, is that Habitat, also together with us, tried to make these changes in the law. And principally, it is possible. It is really possible. There is no fundamental impediment that may hamper the creditability of the condominia. We may optimize the legislation so that we simplify the implementation of the law. Like what happens if there are bad debts, people don't pay as courts are expensive and the condominia definitely do not have the money to go to courts with every fee not paid. And emanating from the Czech and the Slovakian experience, we can clearly say that they gradually simplified this proceeding. Like there are 3 warnings, for example, to the members of the condominia, and if they still continue and persist non-paying, then there is a simplified procedure to have a court decision, send it to the compulsory enforcement service, and have it done quicker. I'm hoping this may be the reality in Armenia very soon. However, there are still certain situations that are problematic and they are not regulated. And the first is the institutional framework. The condominia, they are not good. It's been mentioned everywhere. Spitak and Vajk, we have Dilijan, a number of other cities where there are no condominia yet, and the community continues servicing itself. And we've been knocking at different doors asking the question, do you know that you have to pay certain amount to this community servicing or building servicing entities? And that people are surprised. So generally, these service fees create remonstration among most of the people. That's also true for Yerevan. About 30% may get surprised, and about 60% regularly pay. It's worse in the regions, and it has continued to be perceived as an obligation by the state. They think that it's the government that has to renovate their entrances. Sometimes it happens when you ask them, where did you buy your apartment? They say, it's in a public building, in a state building. I mean, there are still people thinking confusingly that the building belongs to the state. It's the government who owns their building. I mean, the roof is leaking and everything, but they don't want to renovate. But there are also buildings that when you say, okay, if the roof is leaking, will you call the city hall? They say, no, why? But they don't even know that they have to take care of that problem because it's their building. So respectively, it's a transit from the institutional problem towards awareness and perception, which definitely hampers the condominia to perfect as an institution that takes care of the problem. Most of the people in multi-apartment buildings have this perception that the common property, meaning the staircases, the roofs, the basements, and the courtyards, the backyards belong to someone else, quote unquote. This is awful because it first of all conflicts the requirements of the law on property, because the law says if you have property, then you may manage it, but you're also obliged to do things. What, for example? Some standards like disinfection, sanitary norms, etc. These are fundamental functions of the condominium, so that it's clean, it's fine, it's safe, etc. So provided our population yet questions this minimum standards, like making certain payments in order to take care of these standards, we still end up with this chicken and egg thing. I mean, we're in a vicious cycle. Knock at any door that doesn't pay and ask them, why don't you make payments? And the situation Sergey presented, it's truly deplorable. What does it mean, up to 6%, 600 drams or whatever? We see a serious problem here, because in countries where multi-apartment buildings are in a good state, then the citizens may pay 8 to 12% of their gross income for taking care of their property, the common property. I'm saying this because I may also bring the example of Slovakia, and people can tell me that Slovakia is a rich country. Well, however, they pay 8 to 12% to taking care of their condominia. Also capital expenditures, some reserve funds, and servicing some debts and credits, and they purchase Otis elevator and they clearly use it, and they may buy the second one. Our people spend up to 2% of their gross income, so this is also a problem related to the share of the income a person is ready to spend on common property he or she makes use of as well. And this is a mentality issue. We don't pay. We don't pay, we ask the same, why don't you pay? We ask the question, they say, because my condominium doesn't do anything. And I'm sure there is a long list of grievances that clearly explains why the condominium didn't do anything, etc. If you ask the condominium, why didn't you do something? They tell you they didn't pay and we didn't do. So it's an issue of trust. All right. If it's an issue of trust, we're going back to 2003, or the period of 2003 to 2008, when we piloted a very interesting mechanism. We thought, if that's really the problem, there are some heads of condominia that want to break through that vicious cycle and open the road and build trust, then we may enroll them. Because if the money is small, then they may really pay to their housekeeping and spend all the money. I don't want to speak about non-integral situations, non-diligent ones. We have to simply replace them. However, the problem is solved as follows. If I want to buy an apartment and I don't have money, I don't have any accommodation, I may go for a mortgage, buy an apartment, have a place to live, and continue making this tiny fees. The same is about the creditability. This principle of credits has to allow to overcome this barrier. The condominium may get a primary capital investment by which it can do some visible work, and by doing that visible work, improve the trust of the people towards its capacity and responsibility and performance. But instead, the collection rate may increase, and that's, by the way, what happened in Gyumri, in Aparan, in Vanadzor. We would pay $600 to every entrance as a credit, as a lending. Well, first of all, everyone says that they're very risky and quite obscure, elusive, etc. But we didn't have a day of payment late, of a late payment. So with the $600, they would do so much for an entrance that the collection rate would increase to 80%. People just can see. The door has been replaced, the windows have been replaced, there's glass in the window, etc. So essentially we come to financial trust, because banks ultimately have big reserve of liquidity and they're looking for creditors they may issue these credits to. For lending especially, this is very conducive. Ultimately, people are more interested in insulating their apartments and paying less and to the utilities and ultimately have more income. But that mechanism doesn't work for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is the lack of trust. I called my condominium days ago. I was trying to send them a letter. They don't even have emails, not to say Facebook pages. No transparency, no accountability of what the condominium has done, how much money they have collected, respectively. As a resident, you don't trust that entity because you don't know it. Not to say that they do nothing in your building and you don't feel their presence anyway, but you're just paying your money to somewhere you don't know. And that's not a problem for the citizens only, but a problem for the system in general. Please respond, and then we turn to Q&A. You are right on all counts. There is a problem of awareness among the residents. There is a gap in capacity among the authorities with management functions, condominia, communities, doesn't matter. There is a lack of capacity. Well, frankly, we're doing another attempt together with the UNDP right now. You know that the mandatory norms were established yet in 2007, the ones that Astghine mentioned. And there is the minimum, a list of minimum works that have to be done in every building, and they also include energy efficiency. There's like a set of rules, even though the document is yet in a preliminary phase, it's a draft. But I hope that after we get that document finalized, there will be some clarity in terms of what they have to do and what they should expect. Definitely through awareness raising campaigns in the population. Another very important point. Why is it important? Because maintenance, servicing, operation, or energy efficiency in a building is not so well perceived by every head of a condominium or by every resident. And it could be very unique, I mean, in terms of its perception. Something that this can be just painting the walls, some other thing that they have to replace the window of their apartment, and there's no uniformity in understanding. I mean, we need to raise awareness so that people understand what this is about. We also have a gap here, as I said. We have a serious gap in information about the general condition of the buildings. We're now trying to establish a procedure for assessment of every separate building. We're trying to establish kind of a description of every building. We call it passports for buildings, and these passports may include information, general information about the buildings, and also have general characteristics energy-wise, so that all these events are much more tangible, much more targeted, and better guided. Thank you. Thank you. We now have a question and answer session. Let me remind that the discussion we're having today is funding by the Swedish government, and Sweden is exclusively progressing in energy efficiency in the world. I remember I was in a meeting with the chairman of the Swedish parliament in Stockholm, and he would switch off the light on his desk right after he stood up and approached. So there is this much energy efficiency perceived in this country. Every centimeter of this area is used smartly. Questions, please. And I think we need microphones. Onyx is the name of my company. Just a short deviation, if you don't mind. An example. Several years ago, when the streets of Yerevan were paved, were repaired, one person started saying that he found the way of repairing the damaged asphalt. So, I mean, kind of a justification that you cannot do your job well, and then there's a very good way to correct. So, what is now being the justification for the insulation of the buildings? Who's the responsible entity? The Urban Development Committee? I mean, I don't know. Fire prevention, sanitary issues. There are organizations that have a very strict approach to the point, to the issue. But when they go to assess the result of a new building constructed, then 50-60% are not in compliance with the standards. Okay, let me say, and Astghine will complement. These requirements became mandatory since 2016, mentioned in the energy efficiency law respectively. Now, how the new developers or constructors follow the requirements, or how do we make them follow? There is a committee, and after 2016, the Urban Development Inspectorate did not become a part because there was a termination of activity. I mean, there was a decision to take away the inspectorate from that committee. However, the legislation changed, and since August 2017, the inspectorates have been merged, and we have this technical safety, security, fire prevention, responsible body that is going to check whether everything has been done properly in the newly constructed buildings. So I mean that the law says that from the moment you start designing a new building, you have to take into consideration energy efficiency. That's what it is. First and second, those commissioning the building or those approving the commissioning of the building have to check the satisfaction of such requirements, if I answered your question. I'd like to add, thank you for your question, also another painful problem for us. You see, we've done some journalist investigation several times through the whole chain, and I deeply believe that this commissioning acceptance phase is already very late when you go to assess things that have not been done. They will not be done at the moment you assess them or you find them. It has to start from the design. And when you look at the process, the building was designed and constructed, it is clear to you that energy efficiency and insulation and construction norms and standards that were adopted in 2014 were not satisfied, even though the previous one was not worse either. So respectively those that provide for the specific thermal capacity, etc., it's all lost through expert assessment of the design of the building, required by the law, by the way. So all the subsequent phases, like the local self-government body or all the others that essentially do the inspection, they have to compare whether everything that was done is in compliance with everything that was designed. If a design is approved and you go to check whether insulating material was installed in between the walls or not, is not so clear anymore, because it has to end up through an expert assessment. When an expert assessment proves that the design is in compliance or the construction is in compliance with the design, that they don't go back to this problem. So we have a serious problem here, because this is licensed and regulated activity. These licenses became universal several years ago, and hundreds of different organizations have such licenses, and they are not quite diligent in terms of responsibility, let me put it this way. Well, of course, there is a non-written law that seismically this has to be taken into account. There is also inspection on sanitary hygiene, whereas for the building construction norms, it's not been very precise. The highest professionals in construction expert assessment told us, because we went there and we were surprised, and we asked them, why don't you inspect? They're not optional, but they tell us they're optional, and Tanya will be surprised. Yes, all construction requirements are mandatory. There is nothing optional there, and policies emanate from such mandatory implementation of these requirements. Second, all the rules for the design and guidelines for the design also refer to energy standards. So 2 years ago, EU for Energy program, together with the Energy Charter, developed guidelines, and the guidelines contains the description. It tells you how you have to satisfy those requirements, and it also tells us that there has to be a stricter rule. And this rule has to be checked then to what extent it was implemented, etc., with some responsibility upon the licensed companies that may fail satisfying some requirements. So ultimately, there is an agreement with the constructor, with the developer, who prefers not to do insulation by reducing the cost per square meter. Naturally, everyone knows why. Because they sell the building by square meters, they're not going to live in that building, they don't care for the utilities people are going to pay. So I think that has to be somehow regulated. Very true. I don't want to qualify this as illiteracy or maybe deliberate intentional negligence, but the committee is now developing a separate set of documents related to requirements to newly built buildings on safety and security and seismic resilience. There has to be an assessment carried out there because there is a big gap, you're right, and the question is being raised on the right time, and there are certain works carried out, provided it was not about that. I didn't raise the point. But doubtlessly there is a problem there. There is a problem, and this phase of expertise has to be stricter. Because Astghine says some sanctions, unfortunately these sanctions are not always implemented. They are listed in the law, but they're not applied. I mean, there are no cases when sanctions were applied. So that's what we hope, that through such forms of solution, high-risk objects, facilities will undergo complex, or will have to undergo complex assessments. Just a short addition. It was about the newly built buildings. Well, we have to ask which buildings, or what type of buildings. The law says that the local self-governments have to carry out an assessment of the technical condition once in every 10 years for the multi-apartment buildings in the community, to decide the class, the category, and operational level, which is definitely not being done. It is not done. And because of this, this responsibility is given to us, projects. We didn't plan anything like that, but now we have to do it. Which is another problem. And then we saw 10 out of 16 buildings in Vike not eligible for our project anymore because they were third to fourth category of emergency. So I just want to say that our project is related to improvement of energy efficiency and energy saving. However, we do a lot of kind of secondary things. Improving, of course, the seismic resilience of buildings, because buildings in Vike are relatively older. The ones in Spitak are new because they were built after the earthquake. The ones that were built in Vike were built in 1960s. Imagine there is 20 tons and more of just garbage on the roof or under the roof of the building, in the lofts of the buildings. I mean, we cleaned these buildings. We removed more than 20 tons of garbage from the lofts of the buildings, from under the roofs of the buildings. There are technical problems that we correct, improve. So this type of problems solve such issues, but it would be great that there are certain norms, and so the government has to follow these norms and standards because it's also an issue of security, ultimately, of safety. You know, the construction needs some renovation also. I mean, all the works that are also mentioned in the design documents. So the question that you mentioned is also related to the existing buildings. Like if there is a need to renovate, to rebuild, then there has to be some changes in the design. We all say that the condominium fail to do that, or the communities do not do technical assessments. Let's just remember that the responsible entity for the requirements is the condominium. the communities may just organize those works. There are certain differences. So the community has to do that from the money collected in the community and upon the decision made by the community. This is just for your information so that there is no misunderstanding. Tanya mentioned that public subventions this year also include the renovation of common spaces in multi-apartment buildings. Well, I'm waiting to see, really, how many communities, how many condominia will be able to organize themselves and establish a dialogue with the community and come up with applications, etc. So, you know, there is a serious problem here, because even if there is funding, even if there is a grant, then nevertheless we may find it very difficult to implement this task. We have to find a way to work with our communities. There is a cultural problem of cooperation, of working together, of doing something together. There is a big problem with understanding rights and responsibilities. People don't know the law, even though it pertains to their own rights and responsibility. Neighbors do not want to take care of common spaces, just cleaning some common areas. There are countries where this is done better, because the people initially developed those cultures of organizing this joint work, like cleaning the common areas, taking care of the trees and planting some green in their backyards. So this is really something we need now. We need to come together and promote and push this evolution forward in our communities, to have them move to the next level of coexistence, because these buildings do not belong to the government for 3 decades and more than 3 decades already. They belong to you people, and 1/40 of the roof and 1/40 of the staircase and 1/40 of the backyard belongs to you. Apartment number 40, for example. So this is just a page. However, if the building is not insulated, then temperature regimes are disturbed and the lifespan of that building shrinks, especially for those buildings where the beams and the foundation is exposed to extreme temperatures. They may become emergency buildings in a shorter period of time. 19,000 multi-apartment buildings that we have problems with waste collection. Introduce yourself, please, before you ask the question. 1 second. Levan Varosyan. You are an NGO, right? All right. You are very caring, which is truly welcome and appreciated. I would want to participate and help, maybe later. So provided this gentleman spoke of the excessive burden on seismic resilience, then you immediately remember the chicken coops installed over the roofs of our buildings in the city, which they sell even before finishing the construction, I'm sorry. Are we able to do something with this? I've been in the district administration and the city hall, and everyone wants to get rid of this. Everyone washes his hands from this. So, I mean, the administration has changed, the government has changed, but they still don't pay attention. Okay, one point. First of all, it's an additional burden. Second, it's completely distasteful and not uniform naturally. I remember when a child, the architects would implement that kind of control and participate on voluntary basis. 30 years have passed, the time for rascals is gone. However, the new government doesn't want to take the lead in this process either. So, are we able to do something? Well, I said it is truly welcome and highly appreciated, because energy efficiency is the main pivot of your activity, but it's good you pay attention to that. We deviate from the topic, I'm sorry. Just a short response. At least the authorities of Yerevan considered that as one of the priorities. There have been a lot of different scandalous statements related to the mezzanines built over the roofs of multi-apartment buildings. The chief architect has reflected on this. Some topics are being discussed right now. Just seismics-wise, I can say, the old condition of the buildings before the mezzanines were built, well, the fact that it's ugly is a different problem. But the current condition of our buildings is the following. The older roofs collapsed, and those that did not collapse contain tons of garbage in the lofts. Everything's there. For 30 or 40, 50 years, people discarded things on the loft. That's it. I don't see problems with these mansards or mezzanines, but I see problems with this garbage under the roof. Just in terms of, I understand, in terms of assembly and architectural perception, these are deplorable, but I'm sure the media is full of information on what the chief architect and the mayor of Yerevan said about that. I may have a very pleasant conversation with you after. Yes, if that's related, then you may continue at the coffee break, but we have to give the floor to the others for questions, and I'm sure we have another opportunity to discuss the point. Hello, my name is Arsen Karapetyan. I work at the United Nations, the United Nations Development Program. The project that I implement is funded by the Green Climate Fund. The project is called Energy Efficiency in Buildings, Investments, and Reduction of Risks for Investments in Multi-Apartment Buildings. That's how it is called. One question and a clarification. So, market related, of course. Without anyhow discrediting the work that has been done by my colleagues, frankly, this is addressed to your management. It's a little obscure how you missed our project. A project with $20 million. We did not miss it. We did not miss it. There is even a video material that has information about your project. It's been over 10 years, and the previous project was funded by the Global Environmental Fund or Ecological Fund, and a lot more was done there, as my colleague Tanya mentioned, in terms of improving the bylaws and the legislation. So everything has been done in the framework of our project. That's first. Second is a study done in 2011 on 35 newly built multi-apartment buildings. We paid attention to the following. We tried to see whether they complied with their designs, yet in the process of construction. And by the way, only 3 out of 35 were in compliance. About 5 were up to 80% compliance. So the situation was quite dismal at the time. One more point in continuation. When we speak of mayors, deputy mayors, heads of condominia and owners, as an expert in the sector, or as an expert in the project, or as a citizen, I can say they are waiting for us to have this magic wand that would solve all the problems. But that requires significant cooperation when there are many impediments, when LSGs, local self-government bodies, issue subsidies without criteria and procedure. And all the incentives are lost in such a disservice. So I'm sure that everyone has to come to this cooperative platform. There's no magical wand here, and the magic could come if you establish the institutional environment. Tanya mentioned passports for the buildings. Okay, we're thinking now of establishing some information systems for the buildings management, which is a difficult problem, by the way, but can be implemented because a lot of things have to be underlined in those passports. Additionally, to some attachments to those passports. We held a roundtable discussion on the 12th of March, and the fees were also discussed. So when Sergey was saying there is very little awareness, people don't know where their money is going, in most of the cases you don't know who paid for what and what work was done. You don't know. It has to be done. It has to be done gradually. This institutional environment has to be established. That's where this magical wand sits. Everyone's thinking, okay, the money came, let's just invest and see what happens. Okay, you may invest, but it will be lost if there is no continuity. Astghine know this very well. We implemented a project in Artsvik. We installed a very tiny project. We just installed a solar water heater, and I created a separate condominium in buildings around the airport, where residents didn't pay for the utilities for decades. Now, the same community that is being quite skillfully managed by now has 5 bad debts, but now they're in the court, naturally. So the payments are usually very high, on very high level, and people didn't pay for decades, but then they started thinking about their common properties. I'm just trying to say that there are numerous issues here, and there are rules of maintenance, of taking care of what you have invested in. I mean, there's a lot to do there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, but please answer my question. All right, you filled the gap of not inviting UNDP. Just a short comment, last question, and we break. I just want to see 2 main points in what Arsen said. One is the obligatory participation of the citizens, so that they don't think it's all for granted, ultimately, and they bear the responsibility of taking care of their investments or fees they pay. And the second, which is, I think, one of the most important impediments, is the control over payments. As I said, when we have the new changes, these payments will be done through accounts, separate accounts, open for the buildings, because we come back to the vicious circle, ultimately, where the citizen says, I paid and they didn't do, and they say they didn't pay, I didn't do, and some citizens may impute other citizens' payments on them, etc. These are things we have to think about in the nearest future, just for your information. Well, maybe this is good news, but 2 weeks ago, the donor and IFI coordination meeting took place in Yerevan, when the latter discussed the investment gaps in the sector in Armenia. The sector of multi-apartment buildings doubtlessly was discussed as priority, and we also mentioned the technical barriers to the sector, like awareness, the legal framework, etc. But we also said that it is not possible to do energy efficiency when you're isolated. Everyone has to participate. We also discussed other risks in the sector, the multi-apartment buildings. We mentioned that there are at least 20% socially vulnerable families, and of course the closed doors, the abandoned apartments, which are the most risky. Depending on the city, of course. In Vanadzor, the abandoned apartments comprise 36%. So, to support of the donors, EU agencies, IFIs, we decided that it would be better to have those investments and funds that were promised, by the way, at least verbally, to be used for tackling those risks, especially by promoting this collective solutions for the buildings. Like if a building has a social problem, then that might be a public social support problem. If the building has a problem with seismics, then we usually explain that energy efficiency pays back, and that payoff may be earmarked for seismic permanent improvement, regular improvement. However, this is always unilateral. But if we have good precedents, when the buildings unite and apply collectively for credits, then I'm more than sure there will be significant financial products and funds for this purpose, on which we're working intensively. Thank you. Last question. Yes, please. Very briefly, please. Introduce yourself. Aram Grigoryan, Condominium Development Association. Just give me a couple of minutes to refer to this event because I think it's very important based on the topic. When they say that they 100% agree, I 100% agree to the point of view that was mentioned here, that not only in multi-apartment buildings but also in energy efficiency in general. The public policy should be energy consumption management. This is very important, and I think this should also be a part of the energy policies and strategies. Believe me, it's very important. First, when we speak of problems in multi-apartment buildings, the first problem is the condominium. Let's leave this word aside because that's not where the problem sits. There are other problems, and there are many. And if we don't segregate these problems, identify them, and speak in a complex and integrated way about them, the sector will not proceed, will not progress, which is the case for the last 20 years. And the role of the government is very big. I say this because we have a representative of the government here, and it was mentioned that the government has the regulatory function. Indeed, it has. And I might say right away that this regulatory function has not been efficiently implemented by now. I'm not going into the weeds with this, and I would not want to, just for your information. The main problem in the sector is the perception of the right of ownership. We don't have people who understand that it's their own. A little bit maybe, because government has done something, but generally the regulatory function has not been implemented properly. Let me formulate it this way. Because if people had the feeling of ownership with all the emanating responsibilities or feelings of responsibilities, and the market worked that way, then the situation would be different. I'm thinking around this all the time. See, different international, local organizations have certain functions and implement certain projects in which they succeed to a certain extent. I have extended my gratitude to Habitat at the opening of a building at Leningradian Street. Habitat does things with some results. Some other organizations do the same, but I'm sorry, the sector doesn't develop from this point improvements. There's a problem here, and it's in the regulatory framework. And I say this all the time because regulatory framework does not mean law on multi-apartment buildings only. The framework is quite extensive. It's very large, and we have to pay a lot of attention. Now, the law. You mentioned there is a law acting. Well, of course, we renounced from it. It doesn't solve problems. It's a disservice. This problem is a problem pertaining to the rights of the citizens, and these rights of the citizens with all the obligations emanating have to be buried because no one implements them. Thank you. Well, thank you for your opinion. You also answered your question yourself. I mean, indeed, the role of the state is not complete, otherwise the war would have stopped. But in your own speech, you also opposed to this. I mean, if there are companies that are able to fully implement the function, then the regulatory role is in much better condition. I mean, any relation has to be based on an informed way. And to me, not always these requirements emanate from rights. These are just interrelated. I mean, they have to be done together, not being born from each other. Try to do something, invade in their rights a little bit, and you will understand how aware they are. Otherwise, they may pretend or shut a blind eye. Thank you. Thank you. We right now close our discussion, and thank you to the speakers. We'll continue over the coffee break.